if you have not printed out this poem, One Perfect Rose, and this list of 9 items to pay attention to from Blackboard, please do that before you continue with this video. If you go to Blackboard, it's this link right here under Unit 2, Writing About Poetry. So we'll need that as we move through. So go ahead and print that out for yourself if you haven't, and then come back to the discussion. So the first thing I want you to think about before we look at Taylor Swift is this concept of love poetry. And I want you to take a minute and I want you to write down what your attitudes are about love, what your attitudes are about love songs, and if you have read any love poetry, what your attitudes are about those things. So just sort of get yourself going and your mind thinking about your attitude toward love, love poetry, love songs. So pause this presentation and take about 5 minutes and do that, and then when you're finished, come on back and restart, and we'll continue. Okay, so it's good to have you guys back, and I want to talk to you for a few minutes about how love poetry is rather ubiquitous. And the very first love poet, so to speak, was a woman by the name of Sappho. And Sappho lived a very, very long time ago, around 615 BC. We don't know for sure. But Sappho was writing during the same time that Homer was. And if you know about Homer, he wrote the Iliad and the Odyssey. Those great, big, epic poems that talked about countries and heroes and adventure. Well, Sappho was the very first lyric poet, and she wrote about love. She wrote about her feelings. She wrote about romance in the sense that we would think about romance today. So this is really when this genre of love poetry or love songs was born, thousands and thousands of years ago. If you move up in time, around 84 to 54 BC, we meet a Roman poet by the name of Catullus. And Catullus became famous again from going back, borrowing that lyric poetry from Sappho and sort of reclaiming it as his own. And he became famous for a series of poems about a woman that he fell in love with and then later found out was cheating on him. And so he starts his poem cycle, as you might suspect, talking about how he cannot live without her, that he doesn't want to think about life without her. And then he takes us through the discovery of her infidelity. And at the very end, he is calling her Rome's prostitute. So he takes us on a path very similar to what happens today in relationships, where you're enamored at first and then slowly things change, and by the end you're furious with each other. And so this was happening so very, very long ago. And then in the 14th century we get Petrarch. And Petrarch is famous for his love sonnets. And a sonnet is just a 14-line poem that has a specific rhyme scheme. And there are 2 types. There's the Petrarchan sonnet and there's the Shakespearean sonnet. And Petrarch became famous because of a series of sonnets, love sonnets, that he wrote to his lover Laura. And Laura died of the plague. And so he writes about her and her death in these sonnets that, and the form that he created became famous. And then of course you have Shakespeare and the Shakespearean sonnet, where he does some of the same types of things. And then you have poetry in the 18th century. You have poetry in the 19th century, the Romantics that are constantly writing about love. And then on into the 20th century. And when we think about 20th century and 21st century poetry, we really need to think about, as it relates to love poetry, we need to think about love songs. And then that's why we have Taylor Swift up here. And I could have put many, many, many examples of artists today that are writing about love. But the bottom line is that this is a ubiquitous subject for poets, and they all really, really write about a particular view they have of love. Just like I had you do at the beginning of this exercise, what are your attitudes toward love? Well, whether it's Sappho or Catullus or Petrarch or Shakespeare or Byron later on or Taylor Swift or whomever writing love songs today, all of those songs, all of those poems, and even your writings are an expression of love, of an attitude toward love. And so that's what we're going to be looking at in this unit on poetry. Different poets' attitudes toward love, and which ones we as readers feel are most relatable to us. So what I want to do now is turn to a particular poem. I want to turn to Dorothy Parker's One Perfect Rose. And I want you to follow along with your handout, and I want you to listen as she is reading this poem to us, and then I want us to focus on a few aspects of a poem that you should always pay attention to when you're asked to analyze poetry. And those are the things on the bottom of that handout that starts with punctuation, titles, repetition, that type of thing. So we're going to move through those with this poem. But let's first listen to Dorothy Parker read it.
One perfect rose. A single flower he sent me, since we met. All tenderly his messenger he chose, deep-hearted, pure, with scented dew still wet. One perfect rose. I knew the language of the floweret. My fragile leaves, it said, his heart enclose. Love long has taken for his amulet one perfect rose. Why is it no one ever sent me yet one perfect limousine, do you suppose? Ah, no, it's always just my luck to get one perfect rose.
Okay, so let's look at this sheet. If you want to look at it and follow along, and we can talk about each of these things, and you can write down whatever notes you feel like you need to take. But let's go through this poem and analyze it based on these 9 items that we have down here. The first thing that I think is pretty important to look at, this is actually number 2 on the list, is the title of a poem. What does the title tell us about a particular poem? Remember, because a poem is compact, even more than a short story, everything a writer does, from the title to the punctuation, matters. So let's look at the title. Titles should set our expectations. So think about what your expectation might be when we see the title One Perfect Rose. Now, that probably conjures up a visual image of what that might look like, but historically, roses and love are interconnected. We tend to associate pretty much universally love with a rose. And so there's often that idea, that immediate connection between, okay, if this is a perfect rose, then I expect her to write about maybe a perfect love. So as we go through and read the poem, we find out that her version is a little bit different than what we might expect. So titles are important. Punctuation is important. Pay attention to how the poem is read, and pay attention to where the punctuation marks are. If you look down the poem, you can see there's all different types of end punctuation. There's periods, there's semicolons, there are quotation marks, there are, and there's even a question mark. But pay attention to the whole sentences. Notice that it's repeated a bunch, this one sentence. One perfect rose, one perfect rose, one perfect rose. She's emphasizing it. By repeating, she's emphasizing. And that's another item that you always need to pay attention to. Repetition. What is the writer repeating in the poem? What does he or she make you want to pay attention to or call your attention to through repetition? Notice that that one perfect rose line comes at the end of every 4 lines. It's the 4th line. So we have 3 lines, one perfect rose, 3 lines, one perfect rose, 3 lines, one perfect rose. So pay attention to what's happening in the lines before. A single flower he sent me since we met. I'll tenderly his messenger he chose. Deep-hearted, pure, with scented dew still wet, one perfect rose. Well, that's a very traditional view of love and roses. Oh, this guy's sending me a flower. You know, he wrapped it up in this rose. It's, you know, deep felt, it's pure, it's new, it's fresh, it's perfect. And so that's sort of an expectation, right? That is common of love. And then you get to the next set of 4 lines, which is called a quatrain. I knew the language of the floweret. My fragile leaves it said his heart enclose. Love long has taken for his amulet one perfect rose. So again, we're seeing a very traditional type of idea about love. And then there's a blank space, which we need to pay attention to, and we'll talk about in a minute. And we get the last quatrain. Why is it no one ever sent me yet one perfect limousine, do you suppose? Now notice this is the first question mark in the poem. And notice that this quatrain is very different. I know, it's always just my luck to get one perfect rose. Okay? So she breaks from the pattern that she's established. She breaks from a pattern established of traditional views of love, of statements. And then we get a quatrain that questions a traditional view of love and actually has a question mark in it. So in a poem, every single thing works together, whether it's repetition, whether it is punctuation, whether it's titles, everything is working together to communicate one specific idea. And her idea here is something that we can play around with and talk about when we finish our discussion. So, we've talked about punctuation, we've talked about titles, repetition. Now let's talk about symbols. Now, the most common and the most obvious symbol in this poem is the rose. And as I said before, the rose is typically associated with love. But notice here too that we have another symbol, and it's the limousine. Now, why is it, do you think, that she asked this question, why is it that no one ever sent me a limousine? Now, is she just breaking from tradition? Is she just thinking, what can I get? How far away can I get from the symbol of a rose? I'm going to give something big and huge and bulky and that's not, this perfect fragile thing. I'm going to get a limousine. Why do you think she does that? Does she want a totally different idea of love? Does she want something more concrete from love? Or is she just want somebody who can spend a lot of money on her? There are all different ways you can read this symbol and that you can read this last stanza here. So what for you does that limousine symbolize? Is it concrete? Is it something concrete? Or is it something more mercenary? She just wants somebody to spend money on her. Or does she want a different kind of love? Somebody paying attention to her in ways that are unexpected. Does she want a spark? Does she want something different? All of those things you could argue that the idea or the symbol of the limousine introduces to this poem. Also pay attention to word choices. Word choices matter. Notice in the first stanza and this first group of 8 lines before the break, notice that we have some unusual words here. We have flower, and we have floweret, and we have amulet. Now, these word choices matter very much. Flower is an archaic way of saying flower, and you often saw it in older love poems. It also makes the rhyme scheme work, so it could just be practical. But nevertheless, because it's this archaic presentation, we should pay attention to it. Floweret, who uses that anymore? Again, it fits with the rhyme scheme, but it's also sort of an archaic, old-fashioned way of saying something. And then you have this amulet, which is just another name for, an amulet is sort of like a piece of jewelry that someone would wear. Often it had a picture of someone on it, but it had symbolic meaning for the wearer. So we've got all these very old traditional words that are used in the first 8 lines of this poem. And we also have a very traditional presentation of love in the first 8 lines. So everything is working together to say in these first 8 lines, she is just recapping a very traditional view of love. Love, roses, we're all happy. But now, and as we mentioned before, notice what happens here. And I should have a 10th thing. I should have blank spaces. Notice what happens here. There's a blank space. And there is a specific shift. Oh yes, I do. I have form. Rhyme scheme, stanza pattern, blank spaces. Notice the form of the poem. What message is being communicated in the form? Clearly here with this blank space, these 8 lines grouped together and then 4 grouped together, there is a turn. We're getting a presentation of a traditional view of love. Then we have a blank space, we have a question mark, and we have a very different idea or attitude about love. There's a shift in tone, perhaps even sarcasm here. This is traditional, often boring. Here we're shifting, definitely shifting in tone. I skipped figurative language. Notice similes, notice metaphors, notice personification. Similes and metaphors are comparisons. So we have love connected to the rose. We have limousine connected to love, and somehow. So notice that figurative language, how it works together for the poem. Notice tone, we talked about it. We talked about how the tone changed greatly after the blank space. There was a definite shift in tone about how she was approaching love. And then notice the difference from the beginning of the poem to the end of the poem. Is there a change? Does a change take place? And clearly in this poem there is a change. She shifts from a traditional view of love to a different type of view of love. And now it becomes, after we've analyzed all these parts of the poem, our job then becomes, What's the poem's position on a subject? In other words, for our purposes, what is this poem's position on love? Does the speaker want a different kind of love because beyond their traditional? Is she just materialistic and wants gifts that are expensive? Does she value traditional love at all? Those are questions that we can answer that will lead us to a statement about what this poem's position on love is. And the answers to those questions can be supported by all of this analysis that we've done. Does she want just something different? We can support that from our analysis. Is she materialistic? We can support that too. But the bottom line is there's a definite shift in the speaker's attitude about love. Whether she wants just something new and different or whether she's materialistic, she's not satisfied with those traditional symbols of love. She's not satisfied with the traditional aspects of love. She wants more from love and from her lover. So your job would be, if you were writing about this poem, is to say this poem's attitude or this speaker's attitude about love is blank. And then you would use these elements that we've talked about to prove that your attitude is correct. And so that's what we'll be doing as we go through the poems for this section. What are the different attitudes these poems have about love? What do you think they are? Why do you think that? How do you know? And then ultimately you'll get to make a stand on which ones you can most relate to. Which attitude about love can you most relate to?